I want to thank the members of the GAE committee for allowing me to speak today on behalf of Raised Bill 5408. I represent Rebuild Local News, which is a nonprofit national organization, nonpartisan organization, representing more than 3,000 newsrooms across the country. Together, with our member organizations, we advance public policies that counter the collapse of local news. We support policy choices that revitalize community journalism and strengthen democracy. And so I'm here today to speak out in support of Raised Bill 5408, and I urge the committee to do the same. The crisis faced by local news organizations and the communities they serve is well known and ongoing, and a threat to our democracy. It is particularly dire for small and medium-sized communities, some of which are now news deserts, without a source of local news coverage altogether. Connecticut has not been spared from the ill effects of this crisis. We've learned what happens when communities lack local journalism by studying the effects of the closure of more than 2,000 newspapers since 2004, losses that continue at a pace of 2.5 newspaper closures on average per week. Voting rates decline, municipal borrowing costs can go up, government waste increases. Citizens tend to feel less connected to their communities when a local news source closes. Polarization goes up. Even news organizations that have weathered this unprecedented crisis are doing so with fewer journalists. Newspapers that have lost at least 57% of newsroom employees since 2004, even as community populations grow, leaving fewer journalists stretched too thin. Stretching newsrooms to the breaking point is especially common at hedge fund-owned newspapers, which now control about 50% of daily newspaper circulation in the United States. Connecticut knows firsthand how such companies strip their newsrooms for parts. Alden Global Capital purchased the storied Hartford Courant in 2021. Unfortunately, the challenges facing local news organizations are becoming the rule in communities across Connecticut and in every state, not the exception. What is exceptional is the bill before this committee. RB 5408 takes a unique approach to providing public support to what is an essential public good, local news. It is an innovative and hopeful policy approach that not only supports local news organizations through a government advertising set-aside, it will ultimately allow local news organizations to deepen and expand coverage of essential civic and community life across Connecticut, while protecting their editorial independence and adding not a penny to the state budget. Connecticut will lead the nation with this statewide government set-aside approach. RB 5408 is the first bill of its kind at the state level, but others are poised to introduce similar legislation. What is also important is what this bill does not do. It does not restrict the ability of agencies to place advertising where they choose. It does not impact the content of that advertising, and it does not sacrifice the effectiveness or efficiency of the advertising. Agencies still have discretion in how they spend their money. So at this point, I will happily take any questions that you might have.
Thank you. Thank you for your time and your testimony today. Are there questions or comments from members of the committee? Yes, Representative.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for coming before the committee to testify on the bill. You had mentioned that during your testimony, you mentioned that there's parts of the state that are news deserts and they don't receive a local newspaper or some form of print news. I'm assuming is what you meant, correct?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. Do you have a couple examples? I just want to make sure that my district isn't in one of those. I don't
That's a
think
great
so,
question.
but yeah.
In Connecticut, it tends to be the eastern part of the state that is less served. I have a specific list provided by the Medill Local News Initiative that gives county-level maps that show the availability of local news, and I'd be happy to share that.
Yeah, no, I'd be interested in seeing that.
Sure.
So how specifically does this bill help address that issue? How would more print media get to those places?
So it's important to note that the bill isn't just helping print media. It is a bill that helps all Connecticut-owned media, regardless of platform. And what it does is simply ask state agencies to set aside 50% of their existing ad budgets to place advertisements in Connecticut-owned media. And that can include print publications, digital-only publications, broadcast news as well. It does not favor one type of media over another.
Okay. Can I keep going? Thank you. So it's not necessarily helping. So in an area that's been designated as a news desert, because that the local publication has gone out of business or has been bought out and is by a bigger company, and that company chooses not to circulate in that area anymore, it's not necessarily going to bring a newspaper back to that area. It's just going to potentially help with revenue. It's going to help newspapers or other media outlets with revenue and making sure that they don't end up like that hypothetical example ended up, correct?
That's exactly right. And it also has a goal of ultimately helping news organizations expand their coverage so that those communities could receive coverage that they've lost. Okay,
and last question. How do you know what is a Connecticut-based or currently Connecticut-owned media company? Because from my understanding, I thought that, my local, or a regional newspaper was owned by a company in Connecticut, but it's actually owned by another company, which is owned by another company that's based not in Connecticut. Would those types of situations still be considered Connecticut companies, or do the headquarters of that particular publication actually have to be geographically in the state of Connecticut?
The bill provision says that the primary area of operation needs to be Connecticut ownership. However, it's important that the bill also creates a collaborative relationship between a third-party independent organization, in particular in New York City, in San Francisco, in Chicago. These tend to be civic and educational institutions that create a directory that have specific criteria. So it is not on the state to make that determination. It's on an independent third party.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions?
Yes, Representative Blumenthal.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and thank you for being with us today and sharing your insight and your testimony. I had a couple brief questions. One is that it strikes me that if there's decreased local news in a particular area, particularly a state capital, one might expect there to be increased self-dealing and public corruption in that location. And I was wondering if you could provide any insight on what's been observed in recent history on that point.
Yes, thank you for pointing that out. So what we know is that in communities without effective local news, even things like bond ratings can decline because there is no one providing accountability and a watchdog function for local government. We've seen a case, there was an instance in a small town in California where a reporter was able to uncover a corrupt nonprofit that was providing a salary well above and beyond typical for its director, and simply correcting that move by a nonprofit more than paid the reporter's salary for the year. So these are instances where journalists are actively earning their salaries by uncovering abuses of public money and public power. So in communities without that, we also see misinformation flood those communities where there isn't a trusted local outlet. And local news tends to reduce partisanship and polarization as well. People who disagree about national politics can still come together around the need for a new school or the need to fix up a public park, right? So these are publications that build community connectedness, and they serve a special role in communities that national news simply doesn't.
I appreciate that. It's certainly very concerning for the national news environment that local journalism organizations are having so much trouble. And I agree with you. I think they're not only accountability organizations, but connection organizations, and they play that role of connecting people to each other and feeling a sense of trust and in connection to their government as well. I also wanted to ask you to expand a bit on the subject you mentioned earlier, which is the increasing ownership of local outlets by hedge funds or other large investment entities. What have you observed with that across the country, and what effects and trends have been taking place?
Sure. So Alden Global Capital is the sort of primary newspaper owner that is a hedge fund that has made a habit in its business practices of simply stripping their news organizations for parts. They slash the newsroom staff, they slash budgets, and the communities that are the homes to those publications suffer as a result. We've seen this all over the country, and we also see major newspaper chains making similar kinds of moves simply to compete in this business environment. So it is a direct detrimental impact on local communities when large out-of-state owners treat their news organizations as simply profit-making machines. We know that local news has a higher purpose than that, and this bill would reiterate that and support that mission.
Thanks. And a follow-up on that, you mentioned that they, quote, strip them for parts.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that? What have you observed in particular?
So the business methods of these large hedge funds is simply not mission driven in the way that local news ownership is mission driven. Their only language is profit, and so whatever they have to do, for example, we have lost 57% of our newsroom staffs nationwide since 2004. The list of cuts, it comes out almost weekly at this point, from major news organizations all the way down to very small community papers, to the point where some communities owned by these organizations are now considered ghost newspapers, which means that they still exist, they still publish, but there's no actual original local content in them. And so that is what we're seeing, and it's a trend that is deeply troubling to people who care about democracy and the role of journalism in democracy.
Well, I appreciate very much your answers and your being with us before the committee today. Obviously this situation with local news across the country is extraordinarily concerning, I think, for the national interest, but also we've experienced it here in Connecticut. As you mentioned, Alden Global Capital took ownership of the Current, I believe the oldest daily published newspaper in the country.
I think 1724 or something.
Essentially sold its real estate and is still in the process, I think, of steadily reducing its newsroom, which has and continues to contain many excellent reporters who are doing a tremendous job, and they should have more support in doing it. And I think it's just, almost criminal what's being done, especially by some of these large investors to essentially trade on people's trust in their local newspaper while, as you said, stripping them for parts. We deserve, and these organizations deserve better than that. So.
I appreciate that point and your questions. And I want to also point out that Connecticut news organizations have also been incredibly innovative in combating these market forces. They have done fantastic things with online publications and other innovations. So they're doing their part. And as much as the policy approach can help support them, that is what we hope will happen.
Well, thank you very much for your testimony.
Thanks so
Madam
much
Chair.
for your time.